Well, good morning, church. Andy, welcome back. You do know things went really, really well without you. You just take your sabbaticals whenever you want to. No, it is really fun to hear your voice again, and obviously last week I enjoyed reconnecting. So welcome, glad you're here. My name's Phil, if you're a first-time guest, and we are in this series called iWitness, and we're talking about what does it actually look like in today's world to really be a light where you are. In fact, the tagline of the series I haven't talked a lot about. The tagline of the series says, "Love where you are." And that's really important. In many ways, you don't exactly get to choose exactly where you are, the kinds of things you're doing every single day. It just kind of happens. The people you run into or the job you have, it changes over time, but everybody does have context. And the idea behind the series is you can only love where you're at right now. You can't love where you're not. And so it's learning to identify who are the people that God's put in my life that I can bless right now. So I want to ask you a memory question as we begin. Who remembers this particular sermon? Raise your hand. This, to me, it seems like 5 years ago. This was 2 years ago. This was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and so we were at a point where we were all at home trying to figure out what does church look like when you can't come to the building. And so one of our ideas, well, what if we filmed a sermon on location and make it interesting, and we watched this sermon together while we were all in our living rooms at home. Well, the idea behind this sermon, if you weren't here, or if you're a new person in the last 2 years, is I filmed this sermon on a bridge. And the big idea behind it was that a bridge is a connection over a division. And we were actually talking about disagreement and how we get along better. And the bridge does not take away the division that's underneath it. That's still there. If you got two banks you're trying to get across, there's still the divide. But what a bridge does is a bridge prioritizes the connection over the division. And so we talked about what that means with our relationships. I want to tell you about what happened behind the scenes for this particular sermon. This was actually one of the most stressful sermons I've ever done in my life. So I was with Andrew Poteet and Ben Hobbs. They were doing the film work and the audio work, and we filmed this in a creek. And in order to get to the bridge, we had to walk through the creek, and there was one particular time where the water got so muddy and dirty, and there was almost like a big pond in the middle of the creek, and we just couldn't wade through it. So we hiked up one of the sides of the embankment, walked about 20 feet across, and then walked back down into the creek. We were not prepared for what we saw in those 20 feet. When we hiked up the embankment, we found ourselves looking into the large windows of the house of someone that we were in their backyard. Inside those two windows were two small children who were looking at us. And from their perspective, there were three men. We were wearing black jackets at the time, carrying camera equipment, which I'm sure to them looked like weapons, and we have emerged out of the swamp into their backyard. One of them, the girl, about 12 years old, eyes get really big. She starts pointing at us. Her mouth opens. I don't know what she's saying, but it can't be something good. She gets the phone out. She dials a number, and she puts it to her face. We drop back down into the creek, hoping that this is all just going to go away. 10 minutes later, I'm preaching to the camera, Jesus, Bible, yay, all this stuff. Sirens. Like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm going to get arrested for preaching a sermon. So we actually all, me and Andrew and Ben, we just huddle down. Everybody stop. Well, I finished that sermon in a jail cell in downtown Edmond. I'm just kidding. I didn't do that. But everything else in that story is true. I don't think the sirens were for us. They were for somebody else. But it was one of the most stressful moments of speaking I have ever had in my life. I've always thought there's a possibility that I'll get arrested someday. I just didn't think it would be for this particular thing. Now, if there had been another bridge, this wouldn't have happened. We had to cross this muddy part. We had to go up the bank. We just needed one more bridge to get across. And so the reason I tell you that story is I want you to think about a bridge in maybe a slightly different context than what we talked about 2 years ago. I want you to think about yourself as a bridge. So simply put, on one side of the bank here, metaphorically speaking, we have the church. And I mean like the church on her best day. I don't mean the church as far as the caricature that we see anytime the church is portrayed on a TV show. I don't mean the church that is portrayed with the latest scandal in the news. I mean the church that you know through your experience that makes all the difference in the world. It's the church that's marked by fellowship and accountability and prayer together and the discovery of meaning and purpose together. It's church as in the place where you know that you're fully known by other people, but also fully loved. Church. Church as in this community of people where we sing together and we fellowship together and we forgive each other. Like I'm talking about the church on her best day, the bride of Christ. So that's on one bank. On the other bank, I want you to think about your connections with other people that you know that don't necessarily go to church. And these are just people. It's the person you met yesterday at so-and-so's t-ball game. It's the classmate that you were at their house 2 nights ago working on a science project. It's that person that parks next to you every day when you get to work and you don't really know anything about them except for maybe their first name and you know what kind of shoes they like to wear. Just people. It's the person you see walking their dog every single day at the same time in your neighborhood. It's that friend from high school that you saw the other day at a restaurant and you hadn't seen them in 20 years. People. So what would it look like if you gave thought and intentionality to becoming a bridge between these two entities? Here's the really good news about witnessing. Everybody can be a bridge. Like in some of these sermons that I've preached over the last few weeks, some of you maybe have thought to yourself, man, that sounds great, but I'm just not the person that's going to preach the gospel. In fact, I'm not the person that really feels like they understand the gospel. And so the idea of sitting down with someone and talking about my faith, that's so intimidating to me. Like maybe for some of you, as I'm sharing stories along the way in this series of other people in our church who are sharing their faith and building relationships and having Bible studies, like for some of you, your stomach just turns because you think, I just can't do that. That's just not me. Well, if you've thought that at any time in this series, this message is for you because this is really good news. Everybody can be a bridge. Everybody. Because you have people in your life. In fact, you have people that nobody else knows. Like your particular collection of people that you know is unique to you. Nobody else knows the exact same groups of people and individual people as you do. And so therefore you can be a bridge. Now, obviously, do some of the people you know already have a relationship with Jesus? Yeah. I'm sure that a lot of your connections already have a church home, already have a deep relationship with the Lord, and that's great. It's also true that some of your connections are very resistant to God and church and faith and Jesus. That's just true. But do you think that everybody falls into one of those two camps? Meaning, like, if you just made a list of, all the people you know, do you think all of them fall into either, yes, I'm very connected with the church family, or no, I'm very antagonistic towards faith? They don't all fit into those extremes. And so what that means is you do have some people in your life who would be open. You have some people that you know who want a little more meaning, who are looking for relationship. They're looking for something deeper. And for those people, it really could be that God has you in their life to be a bridge. Like, is it possible theoretically for those people to make the journey from where they are now to having an abiding relationship with Jesus? Sure, it's possible. It's just harder. Like, going from one side of a creek bed to another is possible. You can hike your way down into it. You can go across the pond. You can hike your way up out of it. You can do that. It's just a lot easier with a bridge, and everybody can be a bridge. And so here's another way to say this. You can't do everything, but you can do something. And more specifically, you can do something for someone. And so we all probably relate to this. You've probably had this feeling before where there are so many people and so many organizations asking things of your time and your money and your energy that you just get overwhelmed. Like, you go through your email inbox, and this person needs this, and this person's asking for this donation, and this person's asking for this as far as they need your volunteer time. You're just like, I can't do it all. And so what we tend to do is that there's so much out there that we tend to just get paralyzed and do nothing. Well, the truth is, you can't do everything. You can't love every person. You can't bless every child. You can't teach every person the gospel. You can't volunteer for every committee. You can't serve on every board. You just can't do it all, but you can do something. You can do something for someone. And for me, I actually find this to be a liberating truth. Like, okay, I can do one single thing for one single person, and that's going to make all the difference in the world. And so as I get into the text here, and we're going to read a few stories from the book of Acts, don't let this message and don't let this series be overwhelming. I'm not trying to give you 1,000 new things to do. Back to the tagline, it's just love where you are. All I'm trying to say is you've got 168 hours this week, and you've got a lot of stuff already planned, and I get that. We're all busy people. But you can do one thing for one person. And it might make all the difference in the world, because somebody in your life needs a bridge, and you might be that bridge. And so what I want to do is I want to give you two really practical bridge building methods that, again, both come from the book of Acts. Pretty much all of our stories and scripture has come from the book of Acts in this particular series. And the first story I want to read to you is from Acts chapter 16, starting in verse 1, or starting in verse 13, actually. Luke, the author of Acts, says this: "On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there." And so this actually, as we set the scene here, Paul and his companions go outside the city. They're really looking for a place to pray, which, again, supports the idea of last week. Prayer undergirths so much missional activity, both in the book of Acts and in our day today. So they're going to have a place of prayer, and there's other people gathered there. In one of the first few weeks in this series, we talked about the idea of divine appointments. There are certain times where God wants one person to meet one person. And the question becomes, are you open to that? Are you aware that that could happen? So this is what's happening in this story. Paul goes out, there's this group of women. Verse 14, one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God, and the Lord opened her heart. I want to pause there. I just love that sentence. The Lord opened her heart. Part of the reason I love that sentence is because that takes a lot of pressure off the sharer. Your job and my job at the end of the day is simply to be open to the opportunities that come our way. And if there is a moment to speak a word for the Lord, we speak that word. However, you are not responsible for other people actually coming to faith. That is the work of the Spirit. And you play your role, and I play my role. But again, at the end of the day, we have to take a deep breath and trust that the Lord will open the hearts of the people that He is going to open. And that's His job and not our job. Our job is to be the bridge. So the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. So here's the first bridge building method that we read about in the book of Acts. It's a very simple method: hospitality. Lydia had a home. She opened up her home. And from this one home meeting, God did a lot of things. In fact, just to play out a little bit of church history here, so Lydia has a home. She invites Paul and his friends in. They have dinner. They have a meal. Well, the church in Philippi begins at Lydia's house. And so other people start coming to this church. You have people like Eudia and Syntyche and Clement that we read about in the book of Philippians. Well, this church really starts to flourish, and then this church actually becomes the primary financial backer for all of Paul's missionary journeys. And so if you think about the implications here, so like when you're reading your Bible and reading the New Testament, we've got all these great letters to Corinth and letters to Thessalonica and letters to the church at Colossae. Well, the reason we have these letters in the New Testament is because there's churches in these cities. The reason there are churches in these cities in the ancient world is because Paul had funding for these missionary journeys. And the reason that Paul had funding for these missionary journeys is traced back to this little church in Philippi. And the reason that we have a church in Philippi is because one woman opened up her home to a group of people. And so in some amazing, odd, mysterious way, part of the reason that you even have your New Testament is traced back to the practice of hospitality. God can do a lot when people invite others into their home. In fact, I think that the home is a launch pad for kingdom work. Because the truth is, you're going to have some people in your life that they're not necessarily open to coming to church. That makes them feel uncomfortable. They're not ready for that. But they are ready to come to your home. And so the home can be this beautiful place where you say, hey, I just want you to come share a meal with me. This story of Lydia in Acts 16 is not the only example that we have in the Bible of the home being a really significant part of God's story. So if you go to the Gospels, you have Zacchaeus, and he has his amazing moment where he gives up his materialism and repents. That happens in the context of his home. In Luke 7, you have this woman who needs the forgiveness of Jesus. That happens in a home. If you go Old Testament, you got this great story of Abraham, and he actually hosts people that turn out to be representatives of the very being of God himself. That happens in the context of a home. And so all throughout the Bible, we find that the reason that God, even at the very beginning with Adam and Eve building civilizations, the reason he's giving people homes is not just for their own stability or their own privacy. It's really so that these homes can become launch pads for kingdom work. And one of the other great blessings of practicing hospitality, especially right now in our context, is that I don't think we have fully come to grasp the mental, emotional ramifications of the pandemic. For 2 years, we became very isolated people. Hospitality can be this very simple step towards well-being. For many of us, our homes, this sounds really negative, they became our prisons. And we didn't leave them very often for years. Hospitality might be one way for you back to a healthier sense of your own emotional well-being. So all this to say, one way you can build a bridge in your world with your people is simply to practice hospitality. Here's a second way. So last week I talked a lot about this amazing story about Peter and Cornelius, which is this wonderful story in Acts where God wants Cornelius to hear the gospel. So God calls Peter to preach the gospel. And it's just an amazing story about how that happens. And obviously last week I really highlighted how prayer undergirths the whole story. I want to point your attention to one more detail in this story, which is a really, really simple way to be a bridge builder. In verse 24 of Acts 10, we read this. The following day, Peter arrived at Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. He called together his relatives and close friends. If this story was just about Cornelius, it'd be a great story. Because it's a story of a man who's pledged his allegiance to Caesar and country, and he has an encounter with the Lord, and then he makes a higher pledge to Christ. That's a great story in itself. What makes the story even more remarkable is that Cornelius, even before he becomes a believer, practices what I would call the most effective method of witnessing of all time: invitation. He goes to his friends, he goes to his family, and he says, hey, this guy's coming up to my house tomorrow. I'd love you to be there. I mean, can't you just imagine him making the rounds to his wife and his kids, and he's got a big household, so he probably has servants, and he's high up in the military, so he's got 100 soldiers underneath him. He's got officers alongside him, and can't you just imagine him going up to these people, and they have names, and maybe it's someone like Thaddeus. He's like, Thaddeus, there's a gathering tomorrow. Would you like to come? And Rachel, tomorrow, there's a gathering at my house tomorrow. Would you like to come? And he just makes the rounds, and he invites these people to hear the gospel message, and a whole lot of people, way more than just one person, Cornelius, come to know Jesus because of this one simple practice. He invited them. See, invitation can be a game changer. In fact, I would argue that quite a few of you in the room, I won't ask you to raise your hands at this point, but a lot of you in the room know Jesus because somebody said, hey, why don't you come to church with me? Invitation is the most reliable, most consistent, most effective way to bring people to faith. In fact, Gary McIntosh is a church researcher. And he did this recent study, really big study in our country, and he surveyed thousands and thousands of people and asked them all sorts of questions. Well, one of the parts of his survey is he asked this fairly massive, large group of people who had recently gone from being unbelievers, or in some cases, de-churched people, and now they were back to being believers, going to church on a regular basis. So he asked this group of people, he said, hey, tell me why you came to faith, or for those that had come back to faith, tell me why you came back to faith. Like, what was the reason? And there were several options. For some people it was they had read a book. For some people it was some kind of advertisement. For some people it was a near-death experience, and that caused them to rethink things, and they wanted a little more meaning in life, and so that they wandered back into a church building. And so there were lots of answers to that question, how did you come to faith, or how did you come back to faith? But by far and away, the number one answer, in fact, 60% of the respondents to this question said, the reason I am back in faith, or the reason I have come to faith for the first time, is because a friend invited me to church, or a family member invited me to church. 60% of the people that had come believers responded on that particular point. It's because somebody invited me. And so for all the books written and all the research done and all the amazing smart people trying to think, how do we bring people to faith in the world today? I'm telling you, it's not rocket science. It's you and me and us collectively, together with many other Christians in the world, deciding, I'm going to be a bridge. Like, I'm going to intentionally think about who is someone in my life that I could invite to church. I mean, that's where it starts. In fact, I want to point out a few things that you can just start looking for as you're going out in your everyday life and you're interacting with people and you're busy and you're at your job and you're just doing your thing throughout the week. I want to highlight three things that it's really important to pay attention to. And anytime you see these three things come up in your conversation, I'd love you, and this is hard to do, but I'd love you to develop the instinct of invitation. And here's the three things. Number one is transition. When you are having a conversation with someone and they've recently moved cities, they've recently changed jobs, they've recently changed schools, they've recently had a big transition in their own family, maybe their kids have gone off to college, or maybe there's a new relationship, when people are in transition, they're often open to new things. And so one way to train your brain is to say, when I'm in conversation with someone and they're talking about a transition, that's the moment I'm going to say, hey, do you have a church home? I would love you to come sit with me at my church home. So transition's a really big one. Second one is tension. As you talk to your coworkers, as you talk to your classmates throughout the week, you obviously have times where people say, man, I'm really stressed out. I've got this big project at work, or so-and-so is pretty upset with me right now, and I'm not exactly sure I'm going to handle this situation, or we've got a big financial crisis, or so-and-so's in the hospital. I mean, you have these conversations all week. What would it look like if you trained your brain every time I sense tension with the person who's talking to me? What if you trained your brain to say, hey, I've got a church home, and I'd love you to come with me. Like I think it'd be a really, really cool thing for you just to check us out. Transition, tension. A third area that you can just start paying attention to is disconnection. So now I'm sure you've had conversations like this, probably last week, where someone says to you, when I lived in this former city, I had lots of relationships, I just hadn't panned out here. Or sometimes it's, I'm doing great, my spouse is doing great, but my kids, they're just not connecting. When you hear that, your instinct can be, I'd love you to come to my church. In fact, you come to my church, I'll meet you at the door, I'll sit with you. Disconnection, tension, transition, disconnection. And if you can start to make it a habit, I'm telling you, those are the moments that people are open to coming to church. Now, obviously, one of the big reasons that this is hard for us, and one of the reasons that we hesitate inviting others is because we're afraid people will say no. And we do not like rejection. And so therefore, because we don't like rejection, we tend to just back away. Well, I don't want to be overbearing. I would love for us as a church family to get to the point where we could just celebrate invitations regardless of if the people we invite said yes. In fact, I think it's really important just as a disciple just to get comfortable with people saying no. Like, that's not the end of the world. In fact, the other day, I had a long day, and I was in a Uber driver was taking me home from the airport. And I was actually pretty tired, and I was not being a great example. I was kind of wanting to disengage. Well, he started talking, and I asked him a few questions, and it turns out his best friend had just died in a motorcycle crash. So he was really struggling. He's talking about how sad he was, tears in his eyes, talked about the funeral, and just kind of took me play by the whole thing. Well, as he's talking about all this, we're like driving on Memorial Road, getting close to my house, and so I look at the window, I'm like, hey, I'm going to be at that church building tomorrow morning preaching a sermon. I would love for you just to come sit with me. Like, I'll meet you at the door. Like, when you're going through something as heavy as what you're going through with your friend tragically dying in this motorcycle accident, like, you've got to have people. And he was like, yeah, that's a great idea. I'd love to do that. I need to get back into church. He did not show up at church the next day. I was looking for him. But that happens. We have to be okay that some people will say no. Another community contact I was talking to the other day, and he was talking to me about all his family problems. I said, hey, I'd love you to come to church with me. Like, we have a great church home. He didn't come. So I'm like, I'm 0 for 2, but that's okay. And I tell you these stories just to say, hey, no is not the end of the world. Imagine a world in which all of us felt so nervous about the no that none of us invited at all. Think about all the bridges that would not be built. No is not the end of the world. All that I'm asking you to do, and I think that God would be imploring us to do, is just be a bridge. There's somebody in your life that doesn't know God and they're open to it. You could be a bridge to that person just by inviting them. In fact, here's a really simple line that I want you to memorize. It's very simple. You can use it this week. How many words is it? It's 5 words. Do you have Easter plans? I want you to say that with me. Do you have Easter plans? Now say it with me as if you were actually like talking to a friend. Do you have Easter plans? See, there you go. Great job. Now, you might be asking, Phil, like, you're harping, like, why? This is the whole sermon on, like, invitation. Why are you talking so much about this? Well, I got three reasons, actually. Three reasons I really want to hit hard on this particular topic this week. The first reason is, I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a lot of positive momentum in our church family right now. Like, it's been a hard 2 years, and we've had ups and downs, and there's been lots of just difficulty behind the scenes, not just with church life, but just with life, with your business, with your work, with your families, with your relationship. It's been hard. The last few months, we have got a lot of momentum as a church family. Attendance is going up. Giving is great. We just got so much ministry happening again. Like, it's a really, really good vibe for our church family. We want to capitalize on that momentum. That's one reason. A second reason I really wanted to push this hard today is because, to be honest, we're good at this. As a church family, when we rally around an idea and say, you know what, I'm going for that, let's do this together, really, really good things happen. A few years ago, we sent out 2,000 people on short-term missions because we all rallied around that idea. Right when the pandemic started, we had this amazing event on this campus when Lee Strobel came, and we had more community guests on this campus than we've ever had in the history of our church. It's because when we as a collective body, when we rally around something, often God blesses that. And so I feel like I'm playing to our strength here. We can do this. That's part of the reason I'm talking about this. And obviously Easter is in 2 weeks. And this is one of the Sundays of the year where in general people are just more open to coming to church. So you know the line. The line is, do you have Easter plans? Now let me give you a third reason or maybe this is a fourth reason, why I'm really making a big deal out of this. Behind the scenes, we've been on staff talking about how do we measure this? Like, everybody's trying to look for metrics in industry, business. What are the kinds of things that you measure? And there's standard things that we measure at church, and we were on this particular topic trying to ask, is there any way we could measure not how many people said yes, but just how many invitations that we offered collectively? And so we came up with lots of ideas. Some of them are really bad, and some of them probably would have made you feel guilty, and so we scrapped those. And so here's the idea. 1 week from today, I'm going to start my sermon in a very unique way. I'm actually we're going to use we've done this before, but it's software where you can like get on your phone and type an answer to a question and it'll appear on the screen. So at the beginning of my sermon next week, I am going to ask everybody in the room, how many people did you invite to Easter? And you're going to get out your phone and you're going to hit a button or two. It's anonymous. We won't know who you are. And so we're all collectively going to be staring at the screen a week from today, and there's going to be a number on the screen. Now, I really hope that number's really high. Like, I want to celebrate a lot of invitations. And I've already thought, Phil, this is a risk. Like, what if the number's really, really low? And all I can tell you is if the number's really, really low, here's what I'll tell myself. At least I didn't get arrested. It could be worse. It could be worse. But it is a risk. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen this coming week. But that's part of the reason I'm pushing this is next week we're going to measure how we did as a church family. So here's 3 things you can do to invite. Number 1, you can do it face-to-face, which is really the best option. It's someone you know at work, at school. Hey, do you have Easter plans? And if they say, yeah, I've got a church home and we're doing this, you say, that's great. Cool. That's an invitation. We're going to count that. Because again, it's not yeses. I just want you to get in the habit of inviting. Another thing you can do is we have hard copies of invitation cards at all the exits. You can grab a few before you leave today as you're on your way out. You can just hand these out. Hey, I'd love you to come to my church on Easter. You can just hand one of these out. Third thing you can do is, in fact, if you got a phone right now, you can scan that QR code. This takes you to a digital version of the invitation. And one really easy thing you can do is just text someone. Say, hey, my church has got some really cool things planned for Easter. I'd love you to come. So there's your 3 options. You can talk to someone face-to-face. You can hand them a hard copy of a card, or you can text them a digital copy of that card. But please invite people to our Easter service, because next week I'm going to ask you how you did. So that's the main point today is you can't do everything, but you can do something. You can do something for someone, and something you can do. You can be a bridge, and one way to be a bridge is to invite someone to church, just like Cornelius did. So we're going to worship now. And speaking of invitation, we always offer one every week because the Lord is the one who opens hearts, just like he did with Lydia. And so if there is something on your heart and you feel like, I want this church to pray for me, this is your chance. We'd love to pray for you this morning. If there's anything else that we can do for you, you are welcome to come tell me about that while we stand and while we sing.